Breaking news for fans of sister wives. What we're about to share may be the most shocking turn in the entire saga of the Brown family. Kody Brown and his fourth wife, Robyn, have just faced what many are calling their biggest humiliation yet. After years of living in luxury and projecting untouchable status compared to the other wives, the couple has now been brought down. A court's decision has ejected them from their fairy tale home. That is right, evicted. For fans of this polygamous family's ups and downs, this is another than just the usual bump in the road. It is an absolute breakdown of the image Kody and Robyn had so diligently worked to keep buffed. They were meant to be the couple that survives, the ones who made it through the divorces, the breakups, and the acrimonious battles that ripped the rest of the family apart. But now, their crash is making headlines, and the sister wives' world is in shock. This isn't the sort of embarrassment you can hide. It is legal, it is official, and it is brutal. Critics who used to blast Kody and Robyn as selfish are left reeling as the very same couple who resided in the largest house is now packing their bags and moving away from it all. The court's ruling was never about money or material things. It was about accountability, and it showed that Kody and Robyn were not above the law. The Browns had transplanted their lives from Utah to Flagstaff, Arizona, and framed the relocation as a new beginning, a possibility for cohesion, harmony, and rejuvenation after decades of conflict. For Kody and Robyn, however, this was more than a move. It was their moment to become the strongest, most stable couple in a family that was otherwise disintegrating. Christine, Janelle, and Meri struggled with skepticism and compromise, while Kody and Robyn seemed invincible. The house they selected represented that disparity. The audience can even remember the instant the cameras disclosed it. A big house with tall windows, several bedrooms, and smooth finishes that reflected in a manner the other wives' rentals just never could. It was not merely a house. It seemed like a stronghold, silently announcing who the favorites were. Janelle was scrapping by in small temporary dwellings. Christine was smothered with perpetual doubt. Kody and Robyn, on the other hand, seemed to flourish in opulence. The house became more than just a backdrop. It became an emblem. But the symbols don't always speak the truth. Underneath the smiles, carefully choreographed dinners and fireside chats in that enormous living room, another reality was unfolding. The house was not only enormous, it was costly. Every square inch had a price tag. Mortgage payments hung over their heads, property taxes mounted year after year. Keeping such a large estate bled money more quickly than anyone on the outside could imagine. Cracks began to emerge, and fans quickly caught on. Public records revealed unpaid taxes, raising legitimate questions about how deeply in debt Kody and Robyn were. People who previously viewed them as unattainable started to question whether or not they were swimming in debt. Veteran watchers who had blamed Robyn for being the favorite wife now referred to the house as a monument of excess, a reflection of what happens when appearances are more important than stability. And still, Kody held on to his vision of control. He spoke in authoritative tones, attempting to present himself as the patriarch with all things under control. The irony, naturally, was that while he was preaching unity and a common future, the family itself was disintegrating. Christine was already testing the marriage and would ultimately leave. Janelle's resentment of Kody's favoritism was reaching a boil, and Meri had checked out emotionally years earlier, existing on the periphery of family life. Meanwhile, Kody leaned more and more into his relationship with Robyn, creating a life with her that appeared rock solid on the surface, but was tenuous beneath. The house became part of Robyn's narrative. She explained it as the only place where her children could at last feel stable, where stability could take the place of the years of constant relocation and insecurity. She justified the size, the price tag, and the luxury by declaring that it was something that the family required. But to the other Browns and to outsiders looking on, the house was tangible evidence of nepotism. It made it clear where Kody's allegiance and faith actually lay. Nevertheless, the monetary stress continued to accumulate. Whispers regarding forgotten property taxes swirled on the internet, supported by receipts and figures that fans analyzed avidly. The fantasy of security was shattering in the moment. Every sunny Instagram image from the mansion appeared to be answered by another item of past due bills or ballooning debts. The grandeur of the house ultimately served as a double-edged sword, too large, too costly, too impossible to conceal. The irony was not lost. The very house that was meant to represent security had turned into a symbol of excess gone haywire. What had seemed a defiant flash of entitlement was beginning to resemble proof of excess. While cameras rolled on in the kitchen, living room, and on the grand staircase, tension below the surface began to be increasingly difficult to overlook. The funds weren't covering as much as they should. Bills kept mounting, and the other wives were not oblivious to disparity. Christine, from her own less comfortable position, viewed it as further evidence that her sacrifices went unrewarded. Janelle, who had struggled years to achieve financial independence, seethed with outrage at the unfairness. Even Meri, pushed aside for years, could discern that Robyn's comforts were paid for by all the others. The fans, meanwhile, grew louder in cries of hypocrisy. Kody preached fairness while residing in opulence. He preached unity while keeping himself apart. He insisted on loyalty while making favorites. It all fell apart the moment the economic burden could no longer be wished away. Taxes, loans, increased expenses, everything mounted up, and even Kody could not deny it. Behind closed doors, things became grave. Robyn, who had attempted to remain grounded, wept openly as the extent of their predicament became irrefutable. Kody became resentful and infuriated, lashing out at detractors, at his wives, even at the system that he perceived was against him. But something he could not dispute were the numbers. The mathematics was merciless, and the mathematics were not in his favor. The home that once brought pride now seemed like a time bomb. What had once impressed fans now reminded them of arrogance. What had previously distinguished Kody and Robyn now kept them back. Their relocation to Flagstaff, touted as an opportunity for harmony, had instead demonstrated just how divided the family truly was, and how precarious Kody and Robyn's so-called foundation had ever been. By the time rumors of lawsuits and court hearings started spreading, the play was already in motion. The house was no longer just a home. It was proof in a tale of ruin. The price had grown into trouble with the law. And then, out of the blue, Kody and Robyn's beloved was at stake. It was not just ironic. It was bitterly poetic. The same walls were once ringing with self-assurance were now shaking under the burden of overdue statements and court documents. The estate that once represented success in polygamy's never-ending battles had become the battleground itself, and spectators couldn't help but watch. Some were sorry for them. Some felt justified, but all witnessed it occurring. The stage was set. The downfall was inevitable. The only thing remaining was how bad the last hit would be when the judge issued the verdict. And that day, the day when the facade of stability could no longer be maintained, arrived at last. For so long, Kody Brown acted as if he were the man in charge, dispelling criticism from fans, his wives, and even his kids. He portrayed himself as the aggrieved patriarch, the misunderstood leader whose vision for the family was constantly foiled. But in a courtroom, all of that was irrelevant. To a judge, there are no excuses, no do-overs, no doctored history. Only facts, law, and consequences. It was an electric atmosphere from the beginning. Lawyers spoke in hushed tones as papers glided across tables. The relentless tick of the courtroom clock only served to make the tension more acute. Kody sat rigid, arms crossed, jaw clenched, as if an act of will alone could carry him through. Robyn sat beside him, attempting to hold it together, but her eyes betrayed her wide and shiny with terror. For a woman who had held on so tightly to the house, as the center of the family, losing it was unthinkable. This wasn't about finances. For Kody and Robyn, the battle for the house was about pride and identity, and the carefully constructed image they had cultivated over the years. The house wasn't just a place to live, it was a symbol of their status at the pinnacle of the sister-wives hierarchy. While those other marriages had crumbled, theirs had survived, or so they liked to say. Getting hauled into court as defendants facing eviction was a shock neither had pictured when they began their dance on those shiny Flagstaff floors. As the hearing progressed, the truth spilled out. Overdue payments, back taxes, accumulated debt. The same problems fans had speculated about for years were no longer rumor or tabloid headline. They had been presented in detail in formal submissions. Each line read into the record eroded the story Kody had worked so hard to shield. For each time he'd bragged that he was in charge, the judge had irrefutable evidence that he wasn't. Kody tried to talk, to position himself as misunderstood, even victimized, by a system that refused to see how special his family was. His words poured out in the same combination of anger, self-indulgence, and arrogance that fans were used to. But this was not reality television. This was not a show. There were no producers to cut away, no edited highlights to make him sound better. The judge heard patiently, but unsympathetically here. Facts took precedence over feelings, and the facts were incriminating. When Robyn's turn arrived, her voice trembled. She pleaded for mercy, for the children's sake, for the stability she claimed would collapse if they were to lose the home. Tears flowed down her cheeks, desperation evident. For her, it wasn't walls and windows. It was the first real stability she'd known since years of instability. She implored for time, for compromise, for mercy. But the law is not moved by tears, however sincere. The papers were unambiguous. The proof was conclusive. No power could prevent the gavel's descent. Witnesses fidgeted uncomfortably as the judge finally rendered the verdict everyone had predicted, though Kody and Robyn hoped against hope for something different. The verdict was harsh, absolute, crushing eviction. The dream house that had been their symbol of privilege and authority was now no longer theirs. They were told to stand down, to give up the very walls that they had constructed their identity around. The shame was total. Kody's jaw hardened, jaw locked, eyes squinted in indignation, but his slumped shoulders betrayed defeat. For a man who had fashioned himself as patriarch and leader, there could be no redemption from such public stripping of his authority. Robyn, incapable of keeping up the mask, sobbed openly, her wails shattering the courtroom's heavy silence. The image of the favorite wife in tears was one viewers would relive for weeks, the symbolism impossible to escape. For years, Robyn and Kody had been criticized for living in privilege, having comforts the other wives never experienced, sheltered while the others struggled. But in court, that privilege was removed. What was once their sanctuary became a prison, and before long, it wasn't theirs anymore. The decision didn't only rock Kody and Robyn. It set off shockwaves throughout the world of sister wives. Fans who had been watching the family for over 10 years blew up online. Some sympathized with the kids in the middle, innocent pawns of grown-up decisions. Others, far more numerous, however, interpreted the verdict as poetic justice. Karmic revenge for years of cronyism and conceit. Messages flooded in saying things such as, "Finally, he is paying. This is what you get when you put all into one wife." Inside the family, too, the sting was biting. Christine, who had been long immune to Kody's dominance, reportedly felt vindicated. Janelle, who had struggled so long to be financially independent, took the eviction as affirmation of all she had suspected about Kody's irresponsible choices. Even Meri, who had sat on the sidelines for years, couldn't help but see the irony. The same man who had once discarded her and bragged about his real marriage to Robyn was now seeing that marriage fall apart under the destruction of its own fantasy. But this was not about humiliation. It was all about exposure. All the things Kody had sought to hide, his debts, his favoritism, his crumbling authority, were brought out into the open. The judge's decision wasn't merely a legal ruling. It was symbolic, stripping away the last shreds of credibility Kody had left. He couldn't anymore play master of his house. The truth came out, and it was awful. When Kody and Robyn exited the courtroom, no camera rolled, but the picture is simple to imagine. Robyn holding tissues, her eyes red with tears. Kody storming out, his face creased with anger and humiliation. Neither said a word. Both knew their world was crashing. The house was lost. The illusion of stability had disappeared, leaving an absolute public humiliation that no spin could possibly wipe away. The battle in the courtroom was done, but the repercussions were just starting. The gavel had come down. The word evicted rang in their heads, but listening to the judgment was one thing. Experiencing it was another. Eviction is not a moment. It is a process, and with each step, the shame weighed more. He started off with denial. Kody held on to believing he might be able to fight it, stall it, appeal it away. He had always been able to revise stories on the show, to manipulate reality to suit his interpretation. But the legal system won't bend to spin. Days went by, deadlines drew near, and then the papers came. Official papers that made the ruling irrevocable. They needed to go. Reality could no longer be ignored. For Robyn, the house was never merely a building. It was Haven, the first real home following years of uncertainty. Moving it out was losing a piece of herself. She cried as she removed family pictures from the walls and gently put them in boxes as if they were delicate glass. She attempted to be strong for her children, but each sigh, each tremble in her voice betrayed her anguish. Kody responded differently. His sorrow expressed itself as anger. To Kody, eviction wasn't merely the loss of a house, it was the loss of authority, power, and pride. He slammed doors, cursed the system, and yelled about injustice. Neighbors actually testified they overheard his tantrums, bursts of rage that cut through the meticulously preserved FAA he had previously maintained. Anger filled the house, in and out of the moving men who came and went. The humiliation of having them handle his possessions was something he was not going to admit, cut much deeper. It was when the moving trucks arrived that the illusion finally shattered. Fans who had previously thought Kody and Robyn were above it all would have been shocked at the scene. Stacked cardboard boxes in the driveway, furniture being removed piece by piece, once majestic items now down to stacks with little labels. The staircase where Kody used to record interviews was empty. The large living room, once precisely staged for family gathers filmed on camera, rang hollow as couches and rugs were removed. Robyn wept as movers moved the heavy dining table where holidays had been celebrated. She grabbed at mementos, asserting that certain things were too valuable to be packed up. Every object taken away wasn't merely furniture. It was a piece of the identity she had so strenuously worked to establish. Seeing it taken apart in front of her eyes was intolerable. For Kody, the pain came not only from what had been lost but from the neighbors. They stood at the borders of their driveways, watching silently, murmuring, shaking their heads. The man who once marched proudly through the neighborhood as star patriarch of a reality family was now just another husband evicted for being behind on his payments. His celebrity was worth nothing here. To the neighbors, he was just one more guy who lost his cool. The other wives couldn't help but witness the show as well. Christine, finally free of him, told friends she felt vindicated. Janelle, who had suffered financially as Kody poured money into Robyn, viewed the eviction as validation of all she had suspected. Even Meri, who'd been cast aside for years, couldn't resist rolling her eyes at the coincidence. The woman Kody had labeled his real wife was now standing beside him as he lost everything with her. That was followed by the toughest part, breaking the news to the children. To them, this house had been the sole stable presence in a life dictated by cameras, judgment, and the pandemonium of polygamy. They cried as their rooms were dismantled, posters peeled from the walls, beds taken apart. To them, it felt like their world was ending, and nothing their parents said could take away the pain. Robyn tried to reassure them, whispering, "We'll be okay," but her voice cracked every time inside. Even she questioned her own statement when the final box was filled and the doors of the truck closed with a finality. Kody was left in the driveway, standing with arms crossed tightly. Behind him, the silence of the vacant house weighed heavy in the atmosphere. It wasn't merely the loss of possessions. It was the loss of reputation, power, and the delicate image that he had fought so tenaciously to uphold. He had thought in his heart that he could hold on to power forever, but now it slipped from him like sand from his hand. The embarrassment increased further when photos of the empty house appeared online. His fans circulated them jubilantly, labeling it karma. Others cited hypocrisy. For years of favoritism, of giving every ounce of himself to Robyn, while ignoring his other wives, the very life he had created with her had crumbled before people's eyes. The internet did not let up, making them the joke. For the remainder of the family, the eviction was the tangible evidence of what they had felt for years. Kody's kingdom had collapsed. The fellow, who at one time asserted himself as the leader of a powerful plural marriage, was now just a man without a house, fighting for a place in a world that no longer honored him. Robyn was humiliated and heartbroken, and held on to Kody tighter than ever. But even she couldn't deny it anymore. The dream was over. The eviction wasn't experienced as a private struggle. It was done as a public display. Every move to carry a box, every tear, every step felt symbolic. To some, it was tragic. To others, it was deserved. But to anyone who witnessed it, the moment was unforgettable. As Kody and Robyn pulled away from the home for the final time, the truth hit them. What they believed was an untouchable fortress had toppled. The existence they had constructed was lost, and the embarrassment of it was more weighty, more crushing than they could ever have anticipated. News of the eviction circulated rapidly. The Brown family was never unfamiliar with drama, yet this time was unusual. This wasn't about angry words caught on tape, or arguments over religion, raising kids, or having more than one wife. This was real. This couldn't be erased on editing or sugar-coated with slick spin. Kody and Robyn had lost their home, and the entire world was aware of it. Inside the family, the reactions were different, but all were weighted with years of resentment and hurt. Christine, finally free of Kody's grasp, felt something she hadn't felt in years: relief. She had left behind the favoritism and the constant struggle for Kody's attention. Now, seeing him lose the very trappings of that favoritism felt like justice, it affirming that she had made the right choice. Perhaps even prophetically, she had known where he was headed years ago, before a judge's decision locked his fate. Janelle's response was filled with her trademark pragmatism. She had spent years cautioning Kody to be cautious, to plan carefully, to give each wife an equal share of money when it was time to divide the spoils. Instead, she'd seen him dump money on Robyn's comforts. Learning that the house she had warned about was destroyed left her with a bitter, stinging combination of anger and vindication. This was precisely what she had expected. Kody's arrogance, his unseeing favoritism, his conviction that nothing could happen to him. Now all of it lay in ruin. Meri, usually the quietest of the wives, struggled with her own split feelings. She had suffered years of rejection, pushed aside as Kody demonstrated his love for Robyn on television. She had experienced humiliation piled upon humiliation as her marriage unraveled before the public eye. To watch him now deprived of the home that represented Robyn's privileged status filled her with satisfaction she could hardly define. It wasn't happiness, per se, but it had a sting of poetic justice. The man who had so casually dismissed her now faced a dismissal that was public and irrefutable. The children were not immune to it either. For Robyn's children, the eviction was devastating. The house had been a symbol of stability, and its loss left them in a state of terror and despair. Christine's kids were not so compassionate. Most of them had grown up seeing their mother suffer, and Robyn appeared to live in luxury. To some, the eviction was karmic justice. Decades of imbalance finally reversed. The loudest reaction, however, belonged to fans. Millions who had watched the Brown family for over a decade had their say, and it was merciless. Social media exploded with comments, memes, and savage observations. "Karma!" one fan shouted. After all the favoritism, after all the arrogance, it caught up to him. Others couldn't believe Kody and Robyn once so confident, had crashed and burned so spectacularly, the memes were cutting to sarcastic. But all indulged in the schadenfreude of watching the mighty fall. Not all of them were rejoicing. Some of the audience had sympathy for Robyn's kids, who had been caught up in the tempest through no fault of their own. The children hadn't done anything to deserve that suffering. As one commenter stated, they shouldn't suffer because of Kody's decisions. However, even the sympathetic often became cutting when it came to discussing Kody himself. Scant were the number of people ready to give grace to the arrogant, controlling, neglectful man in their eyes, who had done so little for the wives. The public response was a reflection of that of the family itself. A mix of justice and sympathy, sympathy for the victim, and outrage at the perpetrator. The eviction wasn't merely the verdict of law. It was a cultural lightning rod, a subject throughout online communities, fan sites, and even mainstream media. The news headline, "Kody and Robyn Evicted," was never simply news. It was spectacle, scandal, and vindication in one. For Kody, the most painful wound was not the house itself, but being taken away from control of the narrative. For years, he had leveraged the show to command the spotlight, to position himself however he pleased. Even when criticized, he could guide the narrative, spin the cut, and get his side out. The eviction took that away from him. Court documents and notices were out in the open. They could not be molded, melted, or rationalized away. The shame was glaring, inescapable, and beyond his control. Robyn, on the other hand, was the recipient of both sympathy and anger. Some fans portrayed her as the tragic heroine, sobbing as her stability dream came crashing down. Others regarded her as complicit, the spoiled wife whose indulgence had been built on others' sacrifices. Now, having lost it, her tears split opinion. Were they tears for the broken, hearted, or bitter acknowledgement that the pedestal she'd been put on had come crashing down? The extended family had opinions as well. In-laws, siblings, even distant aunts. All chimed in, occasionally with hushed tones. Occasionally online, there were whispers of heads shaking, of saying they knew it was coming. Others said that it didn't have to happen this way, that if Kody had been if he had listened, if he'd put his pride aside, things would be different. The further they got from the incident, the more ironic it seemed. In the end, the responses formed a story all their own. The eviction was not only a legal blow, it was symbolic. It stood for years of favoritism, imbalance, and arrogance finally collapsing. Christine's sense of justice, Janelle's bitter validation, Meri's ironic satisfaction, the divided emotions of the children, and the cutting voices of fans, all aligned into one truth. Kody's empire had fallen, and for the first time, the world watched him without edits, without spin, without his guiding hand. When the dust had all settled, Kody and Robyn were confronted with the toughest reality of all. It wasn't merely the loss of a home. It was the loss of respect, sympathy, and even fear that once clung to Kody's authority. To his family, to the public, and even to the court, he was no longer the patriarch of a successful household. He was just another man who pushed too hard and paid the price.